He was a man who was considered a failure at the age of 65, a political relic, a dinosaur from a bygone era, a man whose own party had turned against him, a man whose warnings about the rise of Nazi Germany had been ignored and ridiculed for nearly a decade. His political career was over. His reputation was in ruins. He was a man who had been written off by everyone who mattered. And then, at the darkest hour in human history, when the forces of fascism were sweeping across Europe and the very survival of Western civilization hung in the balance, this forgotten old man was called upon to lead his nation. He did not just lead, he inspired. He gave his people the courage to fight on when all hope seemed lost, delivering speeches that would echo through the ages, speeches that would rally a nation and inspire a world. This is the story of Winston Churchill, a man who was not just a politician, but a warrior, a poet, a historian, and a man whose indomitable spirit became the symbol of resistance against the greatest evil the world has ever known. But here is what most people do not realize about Winston Churchill, the man who became the Lion of England, the man who stood alone against Hitler, was a man who was haunted by depression his entire life, a man who called his bouts of despair his black dog, a man who struggled with self-doubt and insecurity, a man who was considered a reckless adventurer, a man who made catastrophic military blunders that cost thousands of lives, a man who was deeply flawed, deeply human, and deeply complicated. He was not a perfect hero. He was a man who rose to the occasion because he had no choice, a man who was driven by a conviction that freedom was worth any sacrifice, a man who refused to surrender even when the world was burning around him. To understand Winston Churchill, you have to go back to the beginning, to the gilded halls of Blenheim Palace, the magnificent country estate where he was born on November 30th, 1874, into the highest echelons of British aristocracy. He was born into a world of privilege, a world of power, a world of immense wealth and immense expectation. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant and ambitious politician, a man who was destined for greatness, but whose career would be cut short by syphilis and mental decline. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American heiress, a woman of astonishing beauty and fierce independence, a woman who was more interested in the social whirl of London than in raising her children. Winston was a difficult child, a boy who was often described as willful, stubborn, and impossible. He was not a good student. He was not interested in the classics or the Latin grammar that dominated the curriculum. He was a boy who was more interested in soldiers, in battles, in the stories of great men and great deeds. He was a boy who was determined to make his mark on the world, a boy who was convinced that he was destined for greatness. He was a boy who was deeply lonely, a boy who was sent away to boarding school, a boy who was often bullied and mistreated. He was a boy who was searching for a purpose, a boy who was trying to prove that he was worthy of his family's name.
His education was a series of failures and disappointments. He failed the entrance exam for Harrow School twice, and he was eventually admitted to the lowest class, where he was placed with the slow boys. He was a poor student, a boy who was more interested in reading history and writing poetry than in memorizing declensions and conjugations. He was a boy who was deeply stubborn, a boy who refused to be beaten. He eventually graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, a school that was more suited to his temperament. He was a man who loved action, a man who loved adventure, a man who was not afraid to take risks. He was a man who was determined to see the world, to experience its dangers, and to make a name for himself. He was commissioned as a cavalry officer in the British Army, and he immediately sought out the most dangerous assignments. He traveled to Cuba, to India, to Egypt, to South Africa. He was a man who was not content to sit in a comfortable office. He wanted to be at the front, to be in the thick of the action. He was a man who was driven by a thirst for adventure and a hunger for glory. It was in South Africa during the Boer War that Churchill first captured the world's attention. He was working as a war correspondent for the Morning Post when he was captured by the Boers and taken as a prisoner of war. He was a man who was not content to simply sit in a prison camp. He was a man who was determined to escape. He managed to climb over the wall of the prison camp, and he made his way across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, traveling by night, hiding by day, surviving on sheer willpower and a complete refusal to surrender. His escape made him a national hero. He returned to England to a hero's welcome, and he was elected to Parliament for the first time in 1900. He was 26 years old, a young man with a bright future, a man who had already achieved more than most people achieve in a lifetime. He was a man who was determined to make his mark on the world. The next decade was a period of immense political ambition and achievement. Churchill was a man who was constantly on the move, a man who was always seeking new challenges. He was a liberal, a man believed in social reform, a man who was not afraid to challenge the established order. He served as president of the Board of Trade, as Home Secretary, and as First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. He was a man who was deeply ambitious, a man who was determined to become Prime Minister. But his ambition was also his weakness. He was a man who was often impatient, a man who was often reckless, a man who was not always careful with his words. He was a man who was often dismissed as a warmonger, a man who was too eager for war. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was not always right, a man who was not always wise. But he was also a man who was deeply passionate, a man who believed in the power of democracy, a man who believed that the British Empire was a force for good in the world. He was preparing for the greatest challenge of his life.
The First World War was the crucible that would define his career and nearly destroy it. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill was responsible for the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, a bold but ill-fated attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by attacking the Dardanelles. The campaign was a catastrophe. It cost the lives of more than 250,000 men, and it was a military failure that would haunt Churchill for the rest of his life. He was forced to resign from the government, a public humiliation that would have crushed a lesser man. He was a man who had been blamed for a disaster, a man whose reputation was in tatters. He was a man who had been written off by his political rivals, a man who was considered a liability. He was a man who had reached the lowest point in his career, but he did not give up. He volunteered for active service on the Western Front, serving as a battalion commander in the trenches of France. He was a man who was not afraid to get his hands dirty, a man who was not afraid to share the dangers of the men he was leading. He was a man who was determined to prove that he was still useful, that he still had something to contribute. The years between the wars were a period of political wilderness for Churchill. He was out of step with the political mood of the country. He warned of the dangers of Nazi Germany, a threat that most of his countrymen were determined to ignore. He was a voice crying in the wilderness, a man who was often dismissed as a scaremonger and a warmonger. He was a man who was often alone in his convictions, a man who was willing to stand up for what he believed in, even when it was unpopular. He was a man who was deeply frustrated, a man who watched helplessly as the world drifted toward disaster. He was a man who was convinced that he was right, but he could not convince anyone else. He spent his time writing, painting, and making speeches that few people were willing to listen to. He was a man who was waiting for his moment, a moment that he was not sure would ever come.
The moment arrived on September 3, 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany. Churchill was recalled to the government as First Lord of the Admiralty, a position he had held during the First World War. He was a man who was finally in a position of power, a man who could finally act on his convictions. He was a man who was determined to win the war, a man who was determined to defeat the forces of tyranny. But the war was going badly. The German army was sweeping across Europe, and the British army had been forced to retreat from the continent at Dunkirk. The situation was desperate. The country was on the verge of defeat. In May 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister. It was a moment of profound uncertainty, a moment when the fate of the world hung in the balance. He was a man who was taking on the greatest challenge of his life, a man who was determined to lead his country to victory.
His leadership during the dark days of 1940 was nothing short of heroic. He gave his people the courage to fight on, delivering speeches that have become legendary. He promised his people blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He declared that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He told the House of Commons, "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." It was a speech that rallied a nation, a speech that gave the British people the strength to endure the Blitz, the relentless bombing of London and other cities. He was a man who was not afraid to tell the truth, a man who was not afraid to admit the gravity of the situation. He was a man who was determined to win, a man who believed that the British Empire would never surrender. He was a man who became a symbol of defiance, a man who stood alone against the forces of darkness. But Churchill was not without his critics. He was a man who was often described as a warmonger and a bully. He was a man who was deeply conservative, a man who was not always comfortable with the changes that were taking place in the world. He was a man who was deeply attached to the British Empire, a man who was not always willing to see the need for decolonization. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was not always right, a man who was not always wise, but he was also a man who was deeply committed to the cause of freedom, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of democracy. He was a man who was not afraid to take risks, a man who was not afraid to make difficult decisions. He was a man who was determined to win the war, and he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. His personal life was also marked by tragedy and struggle. He was a man who was deeply devoted to his wife, Clementine, a woman who was his rock, his support, and his confidant. She was a woman who was often frustrated by his behavior, but she was also a woman who was deeply loyal. She was a woman who was willing to put up with his difficult moods, his constant demands, and his endless ambition. He was a man who was deeply affected by the death of his two daughters, a tragedy that he never fully recovered from. He was a man who was often consumed by his black dog, his deep and abiding depression. He was a man who was constantly fighting his own demons, a man who was struggling to keep his head above water. He was a man who was deeply human, a man who was both a hero and a victim of his own ambition. After the war, Churchill was defeated in the 1945 election, a shocking rebuke from a nation that had just been saved by his leadership. He was a man who was deeply disappointed, a man who felt betrayed by the people he had led to victory. He was a man who was forced to confront the reality that he was no longer the leader his country needed. He was a man who was not content to simply retire. He continued to write, to speak, and to warn of the dangers of the Cold War. He returned to power in 1951, but his second term was not as successful as his first. He was an old man,
a man who was tired, a man who was out of touch. He resigned as Prime Minister in 1955, and he spent his final years in quiet retirement. He died in 1965, at the age of 90, a man who had lived a life of immense achievement and immense struggle. The legacy of Winston Churchill is one of the most profound in modern history. He is remembered as the man who saved Britain from the Nazis, a man who rallied a nation and inspired the world. He is a symbol of resistance, a symbol of defiance, a symbol of the indomitable human spirit. He has been honored with statues, monuments, and memorials around the world. He is a man who is celebrated as one of the greatest leaders in history. But his legacy is also a story of contradictions. He was a man who was deeply conservative, a man who was not always comfortable with the changes that were taking place in the world. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was not always right, a man who was not always wise. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was deeply human, a man who was shaped by the prejudices and the weaknesses of his time. Why should someone born today still care about Winston Churchill? Because his life is a testament to the power of the human spirit and the importance of perseverance. He was a man who was told he was a failure, a man who was written off by his own party, a man who was ridiculed by his opponents. He was a man who faced the darkest hour in human history, and he did not flinch. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who taught us that the pursuit of freedom is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human will, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come.
Churchill once said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." He was a man who knew the heights of success and the depths of failure. He was a man who was not afraid to fail, and he was a man who was not afraid to try again. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the victory we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who taught us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a politician. He was a man who was a warrior, a poet, a historian, and a man whose indomitable spirit became the symbol of resistance against the greatest evil the world has ever known. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.